China does matter in the Middle East, and it matters in particular in the big conflicts where the U.S. is seeking to make diplomatic progress. I'm thinking specifically of Syria, where China, Russia, and the U.S. With other countries are working to try to make a UN-led peace process work in Geneva. And one really interesting thing that happened today in our discussions here at the Stockholm China Forum is that talking with Chinese experts in a not-for-quotation setting, we heard some ideas from our Chinese friends about ways to move forward towards some kind of humanitarian corridors or access for humanitarian supplies in Syria that led me to think that maybe progress could be made in this nightmare situation in Syria. So there's an example where China matters a lot. Another obvious example is the negotiations with Iran. China, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, is part of the negotiating group with the U.S. that's seeking to negotiate a comprehensive agreement with Iran to move away from any kind of possible weapons program and instead have a purely civilian nuclear program. And again, in discussions here at the Stockholm Forum, I heard Chinese experts express views that are very similar to and supportive of those held by the U.S. as it tries to negotiate an agreement. So I would say that in terms of making progress on these two most difficult issues I can think of, the ones where people's lives really are at risk, in Syria where thousands of people are dying every month, and in Iran where we still have the risk of war if the nuclear issue can't be resolved. It's been obvious in our conversations here that the path towards some peaceful resolution of these conflicts is one that will involve the U.S. and China working together. So it was important to see that, to hear that clearly from people. And that's one of my big takeaways from the Stockholm Forum this year. The Obama administration's pivot to Asia is the most overused and I think misunderstood statement that you can find in the world in the last several years. In terms of actual practical changes, the so-called pivot has had almost no effect. The U.S. still has major military forces in the Middle East. The U.S. still has quite limited additional military forces in Asia. So I think in a sense the pivot is an aspirational idea. It recognizes that for the rest of my lifetime the big security issues that we need to think about are in the Asia-Pacific area, and that in terms of future basing of ships, future basing of troops and military supplies, being prepared for future contingencies, the Asia-Pacific area is where the U.S. has to concentrate. As we've discovered, the Middle East is easier to talk about leaving than it is to leave. The U.S. worried its traditional partners, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, other countries in the region, just by talking about this pivot. So we went through a period of very difficult relations between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia because they were so nervous. I think that's mostly been patched together. President Obama is going to be meeting with Saudi King Abdullah in March, and so there's a much better tone in the U.S.-Saudi relationship now than there was. I think the issue for China to think about, and to some extent to worry about, is it's clear for lots of reasons. I suppose most important are our painful experience in the two Middle East wars that we fought in the last decade in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also because we have less need in the future for Middle East oil, that Americans are going to be much less willing to commit military force in the future to any conflicts in the region. So what the Chinese have to think about is, how is the security of oil supplies from the Persian Gulf and the Middle East generally to Asia, which is the principal buyer of Middle East oil, going to be protected? traditionally the Chinese have in a sense gotten a free ride off of American military spending. We've spent hundreds of billions of dollars, trillions of dollars when you add it all up, to protect the security of oil transit lanes whose primary beneficiary in the future will be China. So it's a tricky question. Should the U.S. Reduce the size of its fleet in the Persian Gulf and expect that the Chinese will add ships of their own? Would that be threatening in other ways to security? Those are some of the big issues that we didn't really get to talking about much at the Stockholm Forum this year, maybe next year.